Okay, so we're here tonight to talk about invention, about films that mix facts with fiction, about films that blur the lines between life and art, between what might be documentary or not, or what might be made up and totally fictional. We're going to talk about telling stories that are stranger than fiction. About making stuff up in order to tell the truth, or maybe not, maybe just lie and or play with the truth. So you are three filmmakers that each make very different films. I think we could see that with your two films. We haven't seen your film, but I'm going to talk a bit about them. So you're filmmakers who work in very different genres and very different formats, but I think you're kind of in your own way each engaged with these kind of questions and are thinking about issues of art, life, film. What is the difference? Where's an overlap? And questions like that. So I'd like to introduce you first before we actually start talking. I'm going to start with you. Your name is Lucia Margarita Bauer. You're a German-French artist, a filmmaker, photographer, and curator. You were born in Riedling on the Danube, as I read, like a very small town, which actually features in the film you showed today. Then you moved on to live in Berlin in the United States, Ireland, and Strasbourg. You actually trained as a goldsmith before studying fine art or experimental media art, I think, yeah. So you did different things. And you also worked as a curator here in Berlin. Mm-hmm. Yes. And your first short film was called The Snake in the Jar. It was made in 2013 and actually premiered in a film festival, Vision du Réel in Nyon, which is a very important documentary film festival. And this is actually your second film that we saw today, and it just had its world premiere in Rotterdam, I think, right? Wow. So, that's Lucia Margarita Bauer. Nathan Silver, sitting here, is a filmmaker and writer based in Brooklyn, New York. You graduated from New York University Tisch School of Arts in 2005, I believe, and you first majored in playwriting, which I found interesting, considering that your film has to do with the theater and playwriting, and so I think that's something we can talk about later. And then you switched actually to screenwriting, I think, in the last year of university, and became a filmmaker more than the playwright. And actually, in the past 10 years, you made 10 films, if I counted correctly.
One of them, 8 films, 8 completed films.
Okay. Still, it's an amazing body of work, an amazing number of films for you're a very prolific filmmaker. Your last film before this one came out in 2017. It was called Thirst Street, and you already worked with Esther Garel in that one, and also with the director of photography, Sean Price Williams, which did the camera work. In this film, you also already worked with him on your past films, so I thought that was really interesting. And your films have also played in different locations and festivals all over the world. But it's your first time here in Berlin, I believe, with a film, or?
Yeah, we've had films screen at theaters here.
Okay. Okay. So, and then we have Sara Fattahi. She was actually born in Damascus, but has been living in Vienna now, in Austria, for 4 years. You studied law at the University of Damascus, and then also fine art at the Fine Art Institute in Damascus, and you worked as a storyboard and animation artist, I read, for TV stations, but since 2010 you've been working mainly as an independent filmmaker and producer. And your first feature film is called Coma, and it came out in 2015, and it was actually set entirely in one apartment in Damascus, in which your grandmother and your mother live. And so it was set entirely in that place, where they kind of are close to the war, but also kind of sheltered from it, and while at the same time imprisoned. And that film was actually really successful. It also screened in Lyon and at the Biennale, I believe, and it got awards in both festivals. And it was also shown here at Berlin Critics Week. So this very kind of section that we're at right now in 2016, but you weren't able to come back then, right? So this is your first appearance at the Berlin Critics Week, which we're very grateful for. And you made a second film, it's called Chaos, and that was actually shown in Locarno just a couple of months back and received a great award in the competition Cineasti del Presente, which is kind of like for younger, more up-and-coming filmmakers. To talk about that film, Chaos is a discussion between a woman stuck in Damascus, another one stuck in exile, and a third who has recently left. It is a conversation between the interior and exterior, an impossible conversation. And I have only seen parts of that film, but I read that Richard Brody, the film critic of The New Yorker, was actually really impressed by that film. And he compared Chaos to the work of Chantal Akerman and said, it addresses the very subject of memory. It's a conversational film about silence, a visually complex film about invisibility, a film about the possibility of making a film about the war and what's been lost in it. So I wanted to talk a bit more about your film because we didn't get the chance to actually watch it together. So I just wanted to give an impression of what your filmmaking is like. And before I start the discussion, I just wanted to tell you, the audience, you can chime in at any moment and point you like. If you have any questions or comments to the filmmakers about the films we've just seen, please raise your hand and ask. And there's also a microphone that can be brought to you. So I want to start off this discussion by actually talking about mothers and grandmothers. Because, as I said, you're very different filmmakers, but interestingly, you've all made films in which you cast or in which you portrayed your mothers and or grandmothers. As I just said, Sarah, you did this one, your first long feature film was set in the apartment of your mother and your grandmother in Damascus. Nathan, when I Googled you, the first thing that came up, it said on IMDb, his mother, Cindy Silver, appears in all of his films, which obviously isn't true because she does not appear in this film here. Oh, really? She is, okay. I noticed there's another different mother in this film that is, I think, the mother of Esther Garel on the phone, who's very important, who plays an important role. So there's a kind of mother figure. And with your film, it's probably most obviously that it's about mothers and grandmothers. The title is Maman, Maman, Maman. And in the end credits, you say texts, inspirations, and voiceover Maman. So I don't know, maybe you could talk a bit about what it means to work with mothers, grandmothers, why you chose to do that. Was it a way to pay homage to your mothers, grandmothers? Because what were difficulties? Because it seems to be like a really intimate relationship that you suddenly turn into a film and portray on the big screen. So I'd be interested to hear from all three of you about that.
Hello? Yeah, no, it's going on. I mean, my mother plays a big part in a lot of my movies, not the one here. And I'm actually making a documentary about how cutting my mother out of a movie a few years ago contributed to her loss of self-confidence, and basically she accuses me of like causing her nervous breakdown. But I mean, she jokes to me, but in that, like Jewish way where she jokes about it every time we talk. So I'm making a piece now about her where I have her direct a film. Like I talk to her about how working with me has affected her, and then I have her direct her own movie within this documentary, and then we'll see what happens. I haven't shot that part of it yet.
Mm-hmm. And I found a bit on YouTube in which you talk about casting your mother with your mother, and you say kind of like it's all Fassbinder's fault because Fassbinder cast his mother in Deutschland im Herbst or something, and that kind of made you want to do it too. Is that true, or?
Yeah, you blame your influences, you know, the people the first films that really get you. And his mother was in nearly all of his movies, you know, and in some small role. And so I started putting her in small roles in my short films. Then my first feature film, she had like a brief appearance. Then my second feature film, she's one of the leads. And then from there on out, like, I really wanted to work with her.
But she's not an actress, or she has no training as an actress?
No, she was a high school teacher. But she was the reason like I got into, or one of the many reasons I got into art. I guess my father is the other one to blame because he wanted to be a filmmaker but abandoned filmmaking to be with my mother. So.
Why is he not in your movies?
He is sometimes, but he asks that all the time. Why he's not in them more. It's always the back of his head or his voice, like on a voicemail or something like that. But yeah, so I put her, like, I always thought that she was a wonderful storyteller. I'd listen to her, like, talk on the phone for hours each night when I was growing up. And the way she would tell stories, they would go in every direction, but somehow they would, like, it was almost like she was a surrealist because she could connect these things that were completely irrational and somehow make them engaging, or you wanted to, like, she could just bring together elements of reality that completely clashed, and then by the end, it was contained within like a framework, and I could never understand how. So I always think of her when I write, you know, scripts, and I love the way she tells stories. So yeah, that had a total influence.
She usually improvises in your film. Okay, so you really let her do her kind of storytelling or way of being.
Yeah, I mean, my first feature film was completely scripted, and then when I cast her as a leading role in my second one, she couldn't memorize lines and blocking. She hated being told where to go, so it turned into an improvised movie.
And why is she not? You said she is actually in this film in the audience, but that's not a prominent role. Why? Yeah. Why is that?
She had a small scene that we had to cut. Again, it's happened multiple times in the last few years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did that affect your relationship, or?
Not so. I mean, not. It was a few years back when we made this movie, Actor Martinez, and we cut a whole. We flew her out to Denver, Colorado, and shot with her for a bunch of days, and cut a whole section of the movie out that contained her in it. That's the one that really got to her. So. And
Lucia, I read that. Or it says at the end of the film that your grandmother actually passed away in 2013, which is 6 years ago. So I was wondering what happened in these 6 years. Why this film now? Like, why did it take you so long to make this film? Or did something happen in your life that made you decide I have to make this film now? Or so what's?
No, I think such films that take a long time to do because I did also the whole cutting with my mother. And she's also a good storyteller. She's also here. She's trying to hide. Also my brother and my sister. And I don't know, it takes a long time because it's psychological talks you have and going there lots of time and looking at the picture. And I must also say, also to collect all the material, because 80% of the whole film of the material is of my grandmother and my mother, and 20% is actually my own filmmaking.
That they actually did or filmed?
Yeah, they filmed it, and I collected it. Also, the Super 8 films are all from my grandmother from the 70s, and for me, it's also a research to deep into their lives and how they looked. And also, I really like to use that material, because as a filmmaker, you always have this quadrage. Everything has to be perfect and nice and da-da-da. And I like to use that crazy material, and because it has something, I don't know if you say virgin-like. I don't know if you say something like this. And also, it's very important to work with your family, because family is work, I think. And
so you work through issues by filming your family, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, because we come closer and we get to know each other much more. And as I said, marriage, family is work, and I think we need to talk a lot and to open up a lot before they pass away. Mm-hmm. Because for what else do you live? You know, it's okay, you work, you do this and that, but I think it's very, very important to understand that's what I want really to understand.
And at what point did you have the idea you wanted to make this film about your grandmother's death? Was that actually something that formed in 2013, or did that take much longer? Or
no, it's just started before actually, because I told the story to my friend Carolyn, who is also there, who produced the film, and she said, "You have to make a film. You have to make a film." So I also started to collect and the material, and also for my first movie, because it's all. And I do my whole films. It's like a train actually. You can put it at the end. Maybe you have a whole film which lasts 4 or 5 hours, and there are two wagons. I can put them on, and I also can take other stories which are true or not true. Like it's like a system what I started, and it probably take another 20 years until I have like 4 or 5 films, because. Yeah, I don't know. They take a lot of time. It's not, and for me, it's not how many you kick out. It's just that's for me not important, because I also have a family. So it's yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about films as trains or wagons that you put together, because I thought that the motif of the journey is really important to your film. Like the first film you did, The Snake in the Jar, is kind of a road movie trip to the United States, right? And I thought in this film, of course, there's like this metaphorical layer of talking about death in terms of journey. There's these images of the ocean and the sea, and you hear that kind of ship. So this like the idea death or dying is something like going on a journey. I felt, and then of course there's the very actual journey of your grandmother's body and casket and. So yeah.
And I had no material because I was not there at the funeral, and that's the reason I used all the material what I had from my uncle, from my mother, actually from my grandmother herself, and I tried to do it with the most dignity as I could actually, and and actually to talk a lot with my mother about the death, about her mother, and it was important.
Are there questions in the audience already? No?
Can I pour in the whiskey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Sarah. Maybe
actually,
just you
it's
can talk about your first film, Coma.
It's thank you. It's really difficult to talk about my first film now, like because it has been I think 4 years or 6 years since I made it, and it's also I mean from emotional point of view it's hard also to talk about my family now, because I haven't seen them for such a long time, and it's a kind of difficult. But I would say that my first film, I made it because it was like the urgency of the events that took place in Syria, and what's happening and still happening in Syria, war and those experience of losses that we had, made me really, or was the driven to make this film about my family, not about anyone else. So it was a kind of saving part of my memory of my city, which is also like my city in terms of not city itself, but my home, my family, my mother, my grandmother, and what I have from their stories that I keep in my mind. So that's why I made my first film. So
it was a conscious decision to talk about the war from this very constrained perspective.
It wasn't. I wouldn't say that it was the war. I mean, the film. I started the film really long time before even the war started in Syria, in 2012. I think it was after the death of my grandfather. He died in Coma in 2008, and then I decided to make a portrait about my grandmother. And then the situation develops in Syria in a very crazy way, and then I end up like having a film about my mother and my grandmother as a kind of, let's say, memory, like from my family. That's what I could say.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? I also wanted to ask you about autobiography, what your stance towards autobiography is, because I feel that you all make films that are could be called autobiographical in some way or have autobiographical elements, but there's a point in which that notion or claim is destabilized or not true anymore, or is kind of put into question. Like I felt in your film, at the end in the credits you have this sentence, all names and places are fictitious, and that really threw me off, and I was wondering what is that, why? So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
No, we just changed the names and the place, like of this place where it was all about Puy, because it was a wish of my mother. Also to do this. So yeah, that's, I think,
to keep some
really
sense of privacy, or
my film, yeah.
To keep some sense of privacy, or
yes, a little bit, like, so just in case some crazy cousin comes and wants to kill me. No, I don't know, I'm only joking. No. yeah.
And Sarah, your second film, Chaos, there's one character that is kind of an alter ego of you yourself, but it's not you, obviously, because you employ an actress.
It's not me, actually. It's I did some research on Ingborg Bachmann, the Austrian writer. And actually, I wanted to kind of find an alternative way of not to put myself personally in the film, because I wouldn't say that my films, even the first one, even if it's about my family, it's an autobiographical film. It's a personal film, but not really documenting the events that has happened with my family, rather than taking parts of or fragments from what we lived through in the, like, let's say in 7 or 6 years. But the second film was like mainly about those really discussions between 3 countries, or what the war or the violence in Syria fragmented. So I tried to not put myself, I tried to find another alternative voice, and so that was like the actress who was Jaschka Lammert, an Austrian actress who has some like features, looks like Bachmann. You know.
So you wanted to have some setting in Vienna where you actually live, but you kind of wanted to have that distance from your situation and your.
It's a kind of not really a distance, but it's a way to protect also myself from the story itself, or a way of questioning the process of making this film. Because it's really different. It's the second part of a trilogy, which is Coma was the first part, and it's totally different from the narrative of this film is different from the way how I narrate the first film, and it was a kind of I was questioning my process. In terms of filmmaking process. That's what I could.
And Nathan, could I say that your first films are more like naturalistic or have more autobiographical elements in them? Or because I watched one of your first films, Exit Elena, in which your mother is cast under her name, you appear under your name. Yeah. So would you call that autobiographical or not at all? And then the other question is, there seems to be a development away from that autobiographical, naturalistic documentary filmmaking with your most recent films. This film that we saw today, I think, is very striking because it's so artificial in its style and lighting, and in its concern with theater and playwriting and acting. So, and you told me you're really interested in genre. You did another film that is kind of more like an erotic thriller, psycho thriller or something. So how would you trace that development from maybe a more naturalistic style of filmmaking with autobiographical elements to something that's more interested in genre and artificiality or something like that?
Well, I guess with my earlier movies, yeah. I mean, like my mother, like in Exit Elena, my mother plays someone whose name is Cindy, and my name's Nathan in it. But that's because my mom wouldn't respond to another name, and then when she couldn't call me another name, like she kept, like I was supposed to be called Lenny, she couldn't remember that. So, and that was practical. But I mean, yeah, they're all autobiographical to an extent. I feel like this one, there are a lot of elements that I took from my life. Jack, who wrote it, took from his life. I mean, we took from friends' lives and just kind of put in the blender, and you mix it up, and then in the end, you have no idea who it's actually about from real, when you're talking about like a real person, because it becomes fiction, and then the actors go their own way. Like everyone kind of takes it in a new direction. So I'd never think about it in autobiographical terms anymore. I don't know why, but there are elements in there for sure. But did that answer any of that? But the move away from naturalism is because I'm bored of making naturalistic movies, and I like there's something about artificiality that right now I find very seductive, and maybe it's because the world itself is in such a place where artificiality is necessary in order to take in the world as it is. I don't know.
Any comments or questions on the fabrication of this artificial world, which I find very seducing too? No? I have another question for you, because thinking about autobiography, recently there's been much talk about another kind of subgenre called auto-sociobiography. So that's kind of autobiographical accounts that take that are also about like the social background a person is from, like people like Didier Ribon, for example, or Annie Ernaux in France, write autobiographical texts that are very much about their upbringing. And I thought in your film, the whole like background of your family and the house, or the castle as it is sometimes called, is so important. Like the whole setup is so saturated with genealogy or family tradition, and like a background that seems to be saturated with wealth and education or something. All that is that something you wanted to reflect upon or make like think about in your film, or did that just kind of happen? Because I thought what was very interesting is also that you at some point introduced the story of the gardener's wife, which is kind of like a counterpoint to the, it seems, to the story of the house and the family that resides in the house. So.
Yeah, it's always like when you film a krimi, it's always the gardener. It's his fault. That's the reason actually he's also in the film, and it's true actually the gardener did lots of mysterious things, and actually it's very bourgeois what you see, like, and when you live in that kind of environment, you don't realize that it's actually strange. Just after years, when you start to work with it, you just think there's something not normal, so you try to get into that story, and why is it like this? And for me, it was very interesting to really dive into all the characters, which are my family, and to understand what's actually going on there. And many French people or friends, they said it's typical French, it's typical bourgeois what you see there. Like they pretend to have a nice castle, and they're very educated. They like to talk about food. They talk about words all the time. It's like typical French. Yeah, and but I realized that after doing it, actually, what's going on though there. That's yeah, it was a process. How you call it?
Any questions or comments? I keep asking. Yes, please. In Lucia's film? So the question was about sound and the quality of the sound and how important sound is to the film.
Well, it's very important because I changed a lot of stuff. Like I also in the picture, I made it more. I made lots of thoughts in the nice pictures. I worked I put lots of dropouts. I made lots of dropout sounds into it. I made the click-clack sound of the Canon 5D, which is not in the film, but I put it in. And the sound is way, way, way important. And also the whole family is also in the film. Actually, also when I was pregnant, I took the sound of the baby. When my grandmother, the scene of the death, it's actually, you can hear my baby in my body. So everything is all present. Like I took all the sounds which I had in mind or which was surrounding me. And also my other kid was shouting very loud, "Mama!" for the film. So everybody worked actually together. And sound is for me way, way important because when you see a picture, which I work lots of memories come up. You start to think, what did you hear in that picture? What did you smell? And this is how it starts, like then to get the sounds from the internet and to really make it alive, how really your memory was, or yeah. This is, how...
Does that answer your question? Or? Yes, thank you. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I maybe have a question.
Yes, please.
Because when we're talking about importance, and there were many book titles in the film of Lucia Bauer. And I have the question, why are there so many book titles? What is the actual meaning of the book titles there? So I was really interested in these questions. Are they like philosophical questions for what?
Well, these are all the books of my father, because he has thousands of books, especially with all the subjects you have seen. And I always want to read them, but I didn't read them because I never had the time, because there's so many. And for me also it was important to bring my father into, because he's always part of me. So I was thinking, how can I do the chapters? So then I've seen all the books of my father, and I said, okay, I'm going to photograph all the titles, and I'm going to do it as a chapter, actually, because they were really suiting to my film. And I realized, actually, we have lots of in common. How I do my films, and how he reads his book, and how he writes. So that's actually the stories about the book. And one day I hope I can read all of them somehow.
Thank you.
That's a really good question, because I also wondered what's with the book title, the covers of the books, because that's an interesting way to bring books or theory or literature into a film by just really showing their covers. I thought that was interesting. But I actually wanted to talk with you about the role of literature, because as you said about your second film, Chaos, there's this thing with Ingeborg Bachmann. You discovered Ingeborg Bachmann, or you kind of read her and were interested in her, and you can hear actually her voice or parts from interviews, and it seems like she really is a stand-in for your ideas on she becomes a stand-in for your ideas on filmmaking, or like representation of war and violence, and also autobiography at some point. So maybe you could talk about that, Ingeborg Bachmann's.
It wasn't really about the war, as it was about the experience of exile, because she died in Rome in 1974 or 1973, and this interview was made in 1973 with Ingeborg Bachmann. Mainly, she was talking about Malena, a novel she wrote in Vienna. And actually, I wanted not to put my as I said before, that I didn't want to put myself through the film personally, but as I am, I mean, you could really hear my voice talking to the characters, and I mean, I wouldn't say that the camera movement was a camera movement, but it was rather my, let's say, my body movement and my eyes, some parts. But what I picked from this interview was about this analyze of the being detached, or really like having this distance from your own home and your own language, and you question also the environment, and question this exile in itself. So yeah, like I believe that I mean, those layers of which we saw also in the MAMAN, where I really relate to this film, because it's I'm very connected to those really stories, personal stories. But what I really like, those really question of really layers of time and space, that you feel non-linear, fragmented, dreamlike, and this is what I tried also to have in Chaos, this really line between imagination and memory, in a way that really very telling about one's memory and so on.
That's an interesting topic, anyways, memory. So
we can talk about memory, but I want to ask Nathan first about the importance of literature in your films, because you told me you're really into French literature, and French literature was really important to you. And I actually, this film we saw made me think of another Austrian writer, Arthur Schnitzler, something like La Ronde, Der Reigen, which has the same, like similar ideas, or the idea of couples sleeping with another partner,
yeah, passing on an STD and all that.
Right, and kind of, and also the idea of the circle. But by rewatching the film, I noticed that your film too is like creates a circle, or has a circular structure. So, yeah, maybe you could talk about more about this literature connection.
I mean, there's definitely Schnitzler, or I don't know.
Yeah.
Bad pronunciation.
Schnitzler.
But yeah, that came about in a haphazard manner. That wasn't. This was supposed to be a web series, and basically we got funding to make a web series, and then like right before we started shooting, the producers and I decided, like the writer, producers and I decided that it was going to be a movie, and then we didn't tell the financiers. So we kind of slipped it.
Why did you decide to make a movie instead of a web series?
It just seemed like it would hold together better, because we had a very brief window to shoot it in. So we like shot it over the course of 13 days, 11 full days, and then 2 half days. So it was like very tight, and we knew we couldn't get everything to make a series work. And so that kind of dictated that. It also makes more sense, I think, as a movie. Like it holds together better. But it was initially written as a series. So the whole La Ronde thing came about afterwards. Like when I was watching, I was like, oh yeah, it's a similar structure. Literature, I mean, I've made multiple movies trying to like get at The Idiot by Dostoevsky, but I always fail. I think everyone does. Yeah, literature always is. Whenever I sit down to write something, I always just pick up a book at random and like open it up, start reading, and then throw it down, and some ideas come about. I don't know what books I pick up though, but I have a lot. I don't know, but yeah, literature plays into movies. I mean, like I that's what got me into that. That was my first love, and then it kind of drove me into. I wanted to be a poet, then I wanted to be a playwright, and then it drove me to movies. So.
Any more questions or comments on books and movies or literature? And yeah.
I have a question for Nathan. I was wondering what made you decide for that particular look that you have in the film. Like, I'm not expert. I don't know how to sort of describe it, but sort of the overexposed look and the particular color that you have.
Well, we were watching. So we had just shot a movie. The cinematographer and I had just shot a movie in Paris where we brought an American actor over to Paris, and we're watching all these movies where it was like foreign directors going and shooting stuff in Paris and how those movies looked. So we were like, well, what are some like French filmmakers who went to New York and made movies? So we pulled up like these 2 movies from the 70s by these directors that were like softcore gay porn, and so like a lot of the look of the movie comes from those. No, honestly, like he put those on in the background, and we're like, all right, that's the look of the movie, and then and then it's also like melodrama, soap opera, theater, like kind of all clicked in that. And we couldn't afford a matte box we had a very tight budget, and like we couldn't afford a matte box, we couldn't afford filters, so we went to Chinatown and we got plastic. So the whole look of the movie is dictated by this plastic that we got cut, that we taped to the lens, that had it was sparkly filtration, and that caused the weird look. And then like we just decided we were gonna go with whatever. Like we're like, this is for this company that we know doesn't really care about us. So we're gonna go with whatever colors we feel like we're gonna, whatever colors we want to. We're not gonna try and rationalize what we're doing. We're just gonna go with our gut, and that's kind of what dictated everything in the movie. Because this is the first time I've worked with scripted material in a long time. Every other movie before this was basically, except for my first movie 10 years ago, was improvised. So it was like, well, if we have the script we're gonna adhere to, then let's mess around with other elements.
And the color thing, I noticed that in the film before this one too, from 2017, that it's really like colorful and bright and has purple and greens in it. And I noticed here there's some images that are almost like monochromatic, or like only blue or only green.
Where she's smoking a cigarette and stuff, and then he's peeing in the toilet, and then
Right, yeah. But there's also sequences that are more naturalistic in terms of color. So what was the concept behind that?
It was always the gut. Whatever scene we were shooting, we wouldn't think about how it would fit into the story. It was always like, well, this feels right now.
Because first we had green and then we should have yellow, or...
I don't know. When you're on set, you make decisions when you're there. Mm-hmm. And then we just allowed that to happen. Mm-hmm. We kind of knew that the movie would, it would move between naturalistic lighting and then this artificial heightened world. And we wanted the theater lighting to bleed into the world of the characters and to their everyday lives. So we knew that we had to do that somehow. Mm-hmm. So we didn't think about it in a rational way, though. We just kind of we're like, well, this scene could use this light, and then we would put it on.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions on lighting or colors? Then maybe before we kind of slowly come to an end, I would like to ask you again about storytelling. I mean, we already talked a bit about books and literature, but I would like to talk more or look more closely at storytelling, because I feel both your films have very complex ways of telling their stories, and weave together different stories in a very interesting manner. And I think you do the same too in your last film, Chaos, which tells the stories of 3 different women in 3 different places and kind of combines them. So I'd like to ask all of you how you come up with a narrative form or a way of storytelling. Maybe we can start with your film, because I feel it tells so many different stories, and it tells stories of different tonalities. There are some parts that are really funny and happy, and some parts are sad and absurd. And actually you have kind of different voiceover narrators, your mother at some points, but also the undertaker with this Swabian accent or something. So maybe you can talk about how you put that story together, because what really struck me about your film is also that it takes so many detours, and it's so surprising, and takes many unexpected turns, so you kind of never know what's going to happen next. How did that story or narrative come about?
First of all, actually, American series impressed me a lot. I watched a lot of them, so I tried to put that fast storytelling, how they cut the movies. I asked myself, how can I do it with my material? And as I said before, I want to do a train. It's like a series which I put together, which of course take a long time. They won't take like American series, but it will be a series about my life diary. And in that series, in that train, I can put a lot of stories into it. Like it's really made for this, which also maybe the next film it's about another family or another story, but it will be all suited together. And for me, it was very important. Most of it, I took the first voiceovers. Actually, also with my mother. Like we every time she repeated herself, it was not so good. So I really tried to leave it really raw. Also, all the sound, what you hear of my family, everything. It's really what surrounded me at that time, and it's all real. It's not made up, actually. Most of it. So. And the storytelling came actually in the cutting process also, like what can happen next, and when you really dive into that story, like it was not made before, it was like made in the process of storytelling.
Because I read also that the story of your grandmother's body actually was kind of the starting point, or like for the whole film, but in the film it comes very late. So how did you decide on that?
It started with a funeral, but then I changed everything.
Okay.
It's just changing all the time. Like I don't know,
Yeah.
it's just happening until it's finished. It's like a little puzzle, and I also love to do collages since I'm small. So for me, film is like doing a collage all the time. I change things and I put them before, and then I let something else happen. It's actually funny when you like do the cutting process. I think I really enjoy it. When you really are allowed to really deep dive into it and dream about it, like go to bed with a film, and which is not always possible in normal life, but wake up with the thoughts. That's a privilege, actually.
And in the credits, it says that Anne-Caroline Renninger, which you already mentioned, and it was kind of a Wegweiser or signpost or something. So, and you also and René Frölke is also credited, and they are both actually filmmakers in their own right that did did films that are told in a very interesting manner. Did you collaborate with them on the
Yes,
story?
a lot. Like I wouldn't have done it without Caroline. She's my friend. We know each other for a long time in Strasbourg, and we met again in Berlin. And I told her, I didn't know she was actually really in the film business, and I said, "What you doing?" "Yeah, I'm doing my end film of my study, film studies." And she said, "Show it to me." And she was very surprised about it, so she started to produce it. And without her, they would have lied like a diary in my drawer. I would have done it for myself, and I think nobody would have seen it without her. And then René did all the fine stuff, what you see in the film. He really is the best man for understanding also philosophically, like how it has to be cut of the sounds, and he's a master of that. And without them, the film wouldn't be there and wouldn't be also like this. So that's all what I can say, and I'm very thankful to, that they understand it, and because it's really hard to find people who you really let take part of such a personal story, and who really understand what you're doing there. It's a really rare thing, so I'm happy and thankful.
And Nathan, your film is obviously very much about where it has a very prominent way of telling its story by dividing the plot or the story up into five parts, and having voiceover narrators, or like kind of subjective, the people, the kind of the characters telling their own story, except for the part of Nick's part, I think, where there's another narrator. And interestingly, Therese doesn't have a voiceover narration either, right?
Well, hers is a phone call with her mother.
Right.
So it's like we decided we wanted one in French, one in English that were first person, like for standard first person narration. Then the third one would be a phone call. And the fourth one we weren't certain of until the edit. but we knew we wanted it to be different than the other three. And so we decided on third-person narration of an old man who might be Nick is an old man and might not be.
Okay.
And then the fifth one would always be the play.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because the whole setup of basically telling the same story from 5 different angles involves much repetition, but also variation. Like you see the same scene, but from different perspectives. So I thought that was really interesting. And now you say that you also try to vary the forms of narration. That's interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, you want to have fun when you work, right? So we tried. I mean, like, it was fun to write and fun to do. Just not, I mean, if they all had the same narration or the same narrator throughout, I think it would have been kind of excruciating.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Yes. I think all 3 films of you are excellent examples for how private stories can be political. So when we say private is political and political is private, now the kind of polemic question, are there films like based of private stories with the background of, let's say, a privileged world? Do you have these kind of films more privileged to be shown? Like, is there a need to prove the privilege in the movie because of the privileged background?
I mean, in The Great Pretender, certainly the characters, even though they're seemingly unemployed and probably pretty broke, they're still drinking at bars all the time and basically screwing around, and their problems are all just pretty, it's all these vain things, right? So it's about that, I guess. So there's the privilege to tell that and just look at that aspect of that kind of lifestyle. But I'm not quite clear if does that answer any of your question or no?
Yes. Like it's one side, like
Yes.
about your movie. So that maybe I would like to hear the other ones as well.
Sorry, I'm a bit lost now. I'm sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I don't know how to answer that question. I have to think about that. Is that okay? I'm sorry. Yeah. For me, it's a difficult word, privilege. I have problems with that word. I don't know why. And I can't really associate with that word also in my film, really. So I have to think about it. I need a little bit more time.
Can I say that? Because I think part of the word is that we have kind of Vorurteile,
The subject of
prejudice about the word privilege. So, and
I have to think about it. I'm sorry. I have to organize it in my brain a little bit.
But I mean, it could also be a certain freedom in a way that, I mean, I think what you just wanted to say is that it doesn't need to stress only in a negative way to be privileged to do something. I mean, we see really free films here also that have a free structure when it comes to narration, for example, or Lucia, your film is really free because normally you are used to see films with like biopics that show just a linear way to show truth, because they say there is one way how to deal with a life that you want to tell us about, but you fictionalize it and you have a certain freedom how you are narrating this life story in a way.
No, but the privilege is to work with my family, actually. This is a big one, the biggest of all of it, I must say. Until they're like here, and to work with them, actually. and they understand, actually, also my mother, that she really understands what I'm doing, really interested in, which is also not a normal thing, what I know about other, so that's a big privilege, definitely.
Do you want to comment on privilege, or does that resonate with you, or?
It's hard to talk about this point, because I mean, for me, I would say that the most interesting topic of any artist is question this passage of time, and this is what I would say, that questioning time and understanding also, because I would say that maybe if I would consider this is a privilege, maybe a privilege that I have a copy of my family. I can just click on play and see them again as if they are with me. So this is what I could from a personal point of view, but I wouldn't call it privilege, but not because I have problem with the word, but because I have different let's say a different obsession when I work on any story. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I could add. It's a privilege.
It's privilege.
Are there any other ideas or comments on questions on privilege and filmmaking, or privilege in displaying the private as in filmmaking? What do you want to say?
No, I just want to add that storytelling for me, it's really it's an act of really performance, because in a way or another, in the second film, in The Great Pretender, you would see this is in the Western tradition. If you read Browning, I forgot the first name of this writer, where he has The Ring and the Book, where you have 10 narrators narrate the same story. And for me, this act of taking and making is very interesting in storytelling. So I think every act you have, or those two steps in the process, that's taking the consciousness of an experience and make it the experience of consciousness. This is what I would say, this is a privilege. Understanding again what has happened in some certain situations or events, or
Do you want to say something?
Oh no, I think that's a great note to go out on.
Okay. If there are no more questions or comments,
I think that's great.
there's one more.
There's one more?
There's a microphone for you.
If you were talking about political, it's when you're dealing with your families, that is something very, very intimate. And I really liked that you, in your films, gave some idea of family that is so new in a way, even if it's very common, but we are still, when we are in the cinema, kind of expecting that we will see, we have some idea of family. And what you do, it's something that you broaden this idea of family in a very, very good sense. I think this is political about it. It's surprising, but even if it's something that we are living every day, but it's still surprising. Sorry.
Okay, so then this was our closing
What a
note.
beautiful closing note.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you,
Thank you.
all
you.
three of you, for coming up here and telling us about your filmmaking process.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you.